is we're going to share with you some of the things that we think are key trends that are shaping the experience of work in Asia. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about what we think are some of the contrasts across the Asia, because pretty much anytime you talk to someone who's in the region, most of us will say the concept of Asia doesn't exist. It's a word we use to describe a part of the world that actually represents many regions. So what we want to do is compare and contrast a little bit for those of you who might be in roles that are sitting outside of this region. And then the third part will be exploring what do we think of the implications of all of this for HR. And of course, because of where we're right in the throes of this new novel coronavirus, that will be one of the things we'll just touch on a little bit when we talk about trends, since no one can talk about that these days without talking about that. All right, let me go ahead and get started. I'm going to start with Kat. And Kat, tell us, what do you think is really the key trend shaping the experience of work in Asia?
I want to talk about the agile ways of working. I think increasingly, most organizations, if not all, are faced with extreme cost pressure, time pressure, and as organizations get bigger, we have become a lot more bureaucratic, hierarchical, and silo. And I think one of the key trends in Asia is, as we find our way out of this to be more responsive to the market and to customers, is the agile way of working, where work is team-based, out with hierarchy, in with teams, where the focus is really on solving business-critical missions in a time-bound manner. And really, the focus is on the customer's experience. When we talk about agile ways of working, it's all about what do our customers want, and it's not about what does the guy up there want, right? How many times have we been in conversations when we say, let's not do this because the CEO doesn't like it or the CFO doesn't like it? It's immaterial. It's about whether the customer finds it relevant, whether the customer likes it. So that's part of the agile ways of working. And it is not about perfection, it's about iteration. That makes us a lot more agile, that makes us faster and more responsive to the market. And I think that's one of the key trends in Asia. I see an uptake of many organizations doing it. EBS does it. Starhub launched our first couple of agile squads last year and more to come this year. And we have to get on it, because it changes the traditional mindset of what success looks like. It is about shared responsibility. It speaks to skills and not tenure. And it provides a variety of experiences for our employees, which also then speaks to retention. But above all, it focuses on customer. Sorry, over to you. I'm passionate about it.
So I just was going to ask you one quick question, and then I'm going to ask if anybody wanted to add to that. Could you just give us like one specific example where agile ways of working has changed the experience of work in Starhub?
Well, I would say when we launched our first 6 agile squads, these 6 teams of people worked in the Scrum teams on top of their day-to-day job. So they had 2 jobs, right? And I tell you, we started with a lot of anxiety that they might feel burnout, that they might not enjoy it, but they had a big smile on their faces every day. Why? Because it was an environment of experimentation. It was an environment where there was no hierarchy, so there was no power play. It was an environment of shared responsibility, and it was an environment of innovation, iteration. And it really built a new set of muscles, a different ways of approaching problem. And we achieved the impossible. In 10 weeks, we were able to iterate to a product that we can go, a prototype that we can go test, which in normal days that might have taken, I don't know, a quarter or 2, because of the hierarchy, because of the multi-layers of approval.
Right. And I was going to ask Manu, because you're in Sony, which is a very different organization. Do you also see your organization changing in this way?
Absolutely. And to kind of talk about Agile for a minute, one of the biggest changes that has taken place, at least in Asia Pacific and specifically in India, is the formats of working have become a lot more fluid. And it's become a lot more purpose driven when it comes to driving the organizational goals. So, gone are the days when you would actually have one structured vision and mission statement, and everybody would rally around basis their hierarchical structure. Just to what Kat stated, the dynamics of the market have become so volatile, have become so unpredictable, disruptive, that it's become almost impertinent to drive a very quick response to market methodology, which is only possible through having teams coming in together, drive a purpose, and execute that order. The second piece, which has really kind of changed in this entire format as we see it in Sony pictures, and I'll give an example thereon, is the way the organizations derive their business goals as well. I'm sure all of you would be able to correlate that there's one fine day when all the executives of the company would go ahead and actually set the goals for the organization for the whole year. This has changed for us, wherein for the first time last year, we actually had an entire visioning exercise which was done by everybody in the organization, and thanks to technology for it, wherein it was actually a bottoms-up view of looking at what my consumer wants in the form of content, what kind of content they would like to view. And that got rolled up to really saying that as an organization, my forte has to be sports, it has to be general entertainment, and I need to work in newer niches areas of gamification, just as an example per se.
Yeah.
So
those are great examples. I mean, really, it's interesting because I think that every region of the world would be saying similar things. Certainly, the stereotype view of Asia would be that we would be behind or might not have these types of changes, because many of the things the two of you are describing are a little countercultural. And so we can touch on that in a minute about sort of what some of the uniqueness about the ways that we implement these new ways of working. I want to move on to Lewis. Lewis, why don't you share with us, what do you think is a key trend that's shaping or impacting the experience of work today in Asia?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I mean, just to say, I think it's really connected to, what Manu and Kat were just saying. We can't talk about how people experience their work, the future of work, without talking about the role that technology plays in how we get our work done, and just how rapidly we've seen new technologies come into the workplace. And I think in Asia, we've had a lot of opportunity to really experiment with a lot of fast-moving technologies, just because of the fast pace of growth and change in a lot of the economies around the region. I mean, as you were saying, Asia is it's a collection of countries, of cultures, of people, and I love the complexity of it. But it means that we can try all of these different things. So, for example, it's definitely Asia has been a mobile-first place. If you really look at one trend across all of the markets in Asia, it's that most people have some kind of handheld device, a mobile phone usually, that is increasingly.
I think they have more than one.
Oh yeah. So in Singapore, I think the average number of devices per person is something like 5 or something. Like it's a number of devices that you can't even imagine using in a day, which may be why the birth rate is so low here. But I don't know if those two things are correlated. But the idea that that people out at work are just using a mobile device rather than a desktop computer gives us lots of opportunity just to work in totally new ways. And I think what we're going to see is a lot of leapfrogging here, where we expected economies and people at work to have to go through learning to use a computer and then using another sort of more advanced device. Where, for example, I was in Myanmar recently, and you can see there that, perhaps they'll just skip email and go straight to some sort of social collaboration platform that will go through their, through a mobile phone and, and a desktop computer too. But the changes in the way that we work because of the influence of technology, I think that's happening everywhere. But I think we'll see a particular pace about that and experimentation around that across Asia, in China, in Southeast Asia, in India.
It's interesting. the other thing you're making me think about is that, you think everyone's dealing with digital transformation, but I think because of that, you almost see an acceleration because of the adoption of mobile technology and the leapfrogging effect.
Yes. And, because it democratizes access in a way that we've never had before, that's just so spread out in so many markets. And, what I love about what Manu and Kat were just saying as well is just how business oriented is. There's I think so very often in HR, we spend all our time talking about stuff that we want to do to people at work, do to the business, because, somebody somewhere has decided that, that's the right way to do it. What Kat and Manu were just talking about is just how much need there is to work differently because of pace, of experimentation, of customer orientation. And that is causing us to rethink how we collaborate at work, the tools that we use, etc. And I think that's a really big shift for a lot of the ways of working, and the way that HR functions. And I think it's driven a lot by the kind of technology we use. And here we are in a global online event, all sitting perfectly, seeing each other, etc. And this is another good example. We can talk about COVID-19, but we're about to do the biggest global online experiment in flexible working and work from home. And I think this is a great role model. So that transformation is important, I think, and
So
you can't.
Louis, you're touching a little bit on the theme of employee experience. And so I wanted to go there into that because I think that's a real theme for many companies, is really changing the way they think about employee experience. In some ways, even thinking about it more like the way we think about consumer experience or buyer experience. So Manu, I wanted to ask you if that is something that you could share about how your organization, how is Sony thinking differently about user experience at work or employee experience?
Sure. In fact, as we were deliberating on the various perspectives and dynamic shifts which the industry is seeing, one of them actually is centered around the way employee experience is being considered in organizations. And I'm sure amongst us, we would be able to correlate it to our industry set or the corporations we represent. The entire element of employee experience has actually shifted to what I call as extraordinary user experience. What my consumer sees today is a reflection of what my employees are able to offer as a product or a service to them. Correlating it to content, we're in the business of creating dreams and creating escapism for anybody who actually is tired from their days of work and just wants to retire to 1 hour of absolute imaginary world, whether it is thriller, whether it is crime, whether it is comedy, romance. In order to have an extraordinary experience for this set of individuals who are possibly creating an imaginary world for 1.3 billion Indians and a diaspora of about 500 million in the rest of the world, it's very important that their user experience also creates the same ecosystem. In order to do that, one of the biggest things that we follow as a philosophy is not to bottle or not to set processes and systems which actually block imagination. So you have an entire HR and organizational framework which enables our leaders, our employees to play in a sandbox mode, but not really get bogged down by the bureaucracy of 10 steps to follow when, and you can fill in the blank on the employee life cycle. The second is to do away with this layering of bureaucracy, multiple processes, which we all used to love as people professionals, because that's really what defined the core existence of an HR function. One biggest change has also been the DNA shift which the business partners in our functions have taken on. And that DNA shift has been centered around 3 C's. One, a transition from being an enabler or a service provider. It's actually been centered around the first C, which is being a communications and a change agent. The second one has been a coach to employees as well as the leaders as they drive agile ways of working to the disruption to using advent of digital, as Lewis stated. So being a coach to enable the leaders and employees. And last but not the least, to come across as a confidant of employee emotions. And that's really kind of been the biggest changer, because we can actually talk about the entire hire to retire getting digitized. But one thing which you cannot take away is the emotion of humans, which has to be managed by having the right ambulant capabilities on the table. So these are a few examples, and technology has been the foundation of enabling it. And right from emotions and sentiments capture to ensuring that an employee who's used to seeing Facebook in social life has a workplace in their professional life. An employee who's used to seeing a TikTok version of quick micro engagement gets to see LinkedIn learning versions of micro learning formats in the organization, and so on and so forth. So it's
a nice connection with what Lewis was saying earlier. And you used a word that I hear a lot, and I use a lot, which is ecosystem. And I think that's really a shift in thinking that's happening a lot, is about not just thinking about what happens in the world of the organization, but in the broader business ecosystem. So I love your example of ensuring that your culture and your organization isn't creating barriers to imagination in the same way that your own products enable imagination in your customers. I think that's such a great example for us.
Yeah. Alison, can I, because I think, the employee experience, I agree with you, is like one of the hottest topics of this year for sure. And I mean, maybe even the last couple of years. And I really like the way that Manu was talking about it there, as in, thinking about the employee experience, like the user experience of your company, what kind of user experience do you want your customers to have? And the same, when the employees interacting internally, what kind of user experience do they have? I think the other thing that we'll start to talk about this year are some of the risks associated with this. I think we have to be careful, because again, I think in HR we like to do this. We talk about everything as if it's a panacea, like, the answer is this, and that to me, I think, shows a lack of critical thinking sometimes in the way that we approach problems. So, for example, one of the things that we've done with customers to try and help them make decisions with the huge range of options that they've got, welcome to the internet, what do you want to see? And, there it is. And, I'm sure Manu has the examples with her customers and Kat with hers, etc. But one of the things we started to do, for example, is to match people based on the data that we have with them to things that we think that they want. So we created this matching culture, and you can see it with lots of tools and technologies, with music, just an algorithm that matches you to music you like, TV programs, jobs maybe, dates, if you think about dating applications, that's really what they do, just match you to people. And I think that, and obviously some social media platforms have been pulled up for matching people to even just the news that they want to hear rather than any news that's accurate. I think, increasingly I wonder, well, what's the outcome of that going to be? Do we actually start training people just to wait for a computer to match them with something and then just do that, rather than really thinking about what choices they're making and why? Does that get in the way of real learning?
I want to ask you to hold your thought, because this is a great comment for the third part where we start to talk about implications for
Good
HR.
point.
I think you're touching on both, man versus machine, or woman versus machine, and the need to prioritize. I wanted to just ask Su-Yen to share her perspective on what she sees as the key trend, and then we'll move to part 2. Over to you, Su-Yen.
Yeah, you know how in real estate, it's always location, location, location. In the people business, a big issue is around Asian context. You've got, Hong Kong and Japan that top the global life expectancy charts at something like 85 years old. Singapore, I think, is at 84, Korea, 83. When you've got this kind of a situation, it surely affects the work experience, because one of the things that I hear very often from my clients is things like, how do I manage the multiple generations in the workforce? Whether it's about engagement, because you have different people at different, I mean, whether we think it's about generations or whether we think it's about life stage, you can come in at either end of the debate, but the issue is still the same, which is that, you know, somebody who today is in the workforce and 22 years old wants something very different from somebody who's 5-year-old. So I think as you think about trends, this is the macro overlay that employers really have to deal with. The other point relating to demographics really has to do with how careers are shifting and changing over the course of one generation, as well as the individual from a reinvention perspective.
So those two things, I apologize, I think you're cutting out a tiny bit. I wanted to make sure that people heard your two trends, because I think they're so important. And one is about demographics and how major demographic shifts are impacting who is at work. So, and then also the changing length of careers. In both, and I think what's interesting is that in Asia, you see everything, right? You see Japan, which is aging faster than pretty much any country in the world, compared to, say, a Vietnam that has a large young population. So you have these extremes of populations, and then you have other workplaces, like you said, where you have maybe 5 generations at work together that you never would have seen 20 years ago.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, like a place like Vietnam, young but aging quickly, right? So it's a bit of a paradox fact, you know. So it's how do you actually deal with the workforce of today, while at the same time, you know, recognizing that in a very short period of time, their life expectancy is going to increase significantly as well.
So yeah, I was going to ask you a question, because I always assume that with aging population, people are going to work longer, and your view is that careers are shorter. Can you just say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think they are two sides of the same coin. So yes, people will work longer, but they will cycle through multiple careers. So a career might be shorter, but over the course of working life, one might take on 3 careers, 4 careers, 5 careers. And this isn't about jobs. You know, you can cycle through 4 jobs as a marketing person. It's about fundamental shifts in the domain. So you might have somebody who's grown up as an accountant who then decides they're going to move into becoming an entrepreneur. You might have somebody who started out as, you know, a lawyer who then decided to move into theater. I mean, it's actually quite radically different. And over the course of one's lifetime, if you have a 60-year career, and a career, let's give it a long runway, 20 years, that's 3 full solid careers. So I think they are not, it's a paradox.
Well, and it's also interesting because what you're saying is so reinforced here in Singapore by the activities of the Singapore government to really encourage lifelong learning and greater career flexibility. So you really see a lot of proactivity on the part of the government to engage with education and also employers to help arm people with skills that they need for the future.
That's right.
Cool. I'm going to ask if anybody else has anything they want to say about trends before I ask the big question. Clearly, well, so I'll stop. And also for those of you listening, don't forget to write in questions that you might have. You can just, there's a little feature where it says more at the bottom of the screen, and then you can click on it and you'll see chat, and you can type in questions that we'll be able to see and make sure that we ask the panel. I want to just take a few minutes to ask about this novel coronavirus, or the disease of COVID-19. It's clearly impacting different countries in different ways. How do you see this playing out in the region over the next 3 months? And I'll let anybody go first. Youngest to oldest. Okay, that's so unfair. Alphabetical order. Kat, go be you.
Well, I'm certainly not the youngest, so I was quite happy for a younger person to go first. Like Louis, for example. You know, how do I see it play out? I actually believe that give it a bit more time, things will find its natural rhythm. I think what we are seeing is disease that is highly contagious, but not very fatal, right? Thankfully, right? So I see things kind of stabilizing and normalizing after a while. I also see that this has forced most organization, many of us, to learn to work in a more virtual and digital way. Louis said it earlier on that this is a great example, role model. And I actually think, I mean, for Starhub, we have not been very digital in the way we work. And this has forced us to be that way. And I actually think it's a good direction.
Right.
But sometimes when you are put in a corner, that's when innovation happens. That's when you really embrace new ways of doing things because you have no choice. Now, it will have tremendous impact on the economy, as we are seeing now already.
Hey, Kat, at Starhub, are you guys implementing this Plan A, Plan B kind of workforce? So
well,
you might describe that. That might be different than what people are accustomed to.
Right. So we have a Plan A, Plan B. Essentially, we split the organization into two. That is to ensure business continuity and resilience. We actually tried it for 3 days, right, across the organization. And in certain critical parts of our business, the call center network, we have split teams operating since about a month ago.
Yeah.
Right. That is really, really just to ensure resilience. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I have to share one little personal story because I'm an adjunct professor at the NUS Business School, and they did this at NUS several weeks ago. And so then they formed WhatsApp groups for the faculty, and everyone in my department, I'm in management and organization, we're so happy because for the first time we were actually using social media to connect with each other in a different way.
Right?
And then that led to other kind of more pro-social and community kind of behavior. So I thought that was it was sort of an unintended positive consequence of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
okay, the next youngest person gets to go now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean,
what did you want to say?
So just a couple of things. So I do think it's very interesting that the response to this, has been to kind of look at the administrative procedures. The kind of like, oh, we should have a vaccine for this is kind of a sub-bullet in the overall narrative, which is that, as a society, I think it's really impressive actually to see every country kind of mobilizing its resources just to say, look, this is how we protect ourselves from this. It's about behaviors. So it's really good, interesting. It's like, wash your hands, etc. Like this huge communication engine really ramping up. It's about communication. It's about awareness. And, even internally in organizations, them saying, checking, have you heard of this? Do you understand our response? Do you understand the risks involved? And how we are intending to manage this within your context. So to me, I think it shows just how far we've come in our thinking around responding to normal and natural events like this. We have to remember that pandemics are just a product of life. And, what we've decided as a global society is the best way to respond to those is to manage them effectively. Now, I do think clearly there have been some gaps which we will learn from. I think China in particular will look at its response, which I do think is, been a way, very proactive, but, they obviously had some things they wanted to do better. And I think there are a few things in many countries where we look and say, we could have done that better. I think Singapore has been very impressive in terms of its speed, transparency, just sophistication in terms of managing this. But yes, I think that, it's teaching us something about how we manage behavior in order to address a big critical risk like this. Organizations responding very proactively. And I think the real question for us now is, how do we keep momentum, keep moving? What is the global economic impact? There obviously will be some, but how do we bounce back quickly?
Yeah. I just wanted to see if Suyin had anything to add, and then I'm going to move on to the next piece.
I'll just add 2 points. One is just building a little bit on what both Catherine and Lewis have talked about is, I actually think that this is creating a huge culture change. Companies have been trying for years from a diversity standpoint to encourage more flexible working, right? But in many parts of Asia, that actually hasn't been taking hold because there's this kind of expectation or culture or whatever you want to call it, where, FaceTime and being seen to be, somewhere that you can be seen as foreign. Well, I think if this lasts a little bit longer, people will basically figure out, hey, work's still happening, work's still getting done. And I actually think that will make a huge difference in terms of building in much more of a flexible working culture. And I think that will actually have offshoots into diversity. I think the second point that flows on from that then is the issue of diversification. I think through this experience, a lot of companies have really come to rethink how you think about diversification, whether it's goods, services, or talent. And of course, if you can now work flexibly, you can be a lot more broad-based or flexible in terms of thinking of where you source and manage your talent from.
That's great. Well, I want to...
I'd like to add one more point around COVID, which is centered around what I call as responsible communication. While we've heard from Kat, from Lewis, from Seong about how corporations have adapted to this uncertainty and a very disruptive change that has impacted the world, one more piece which has come to light, and I think all of us are recipients of world leaders talking about it, to media really taking the front and focus, is how do I be a responsible social citizen globally and not spread rumors or create a hype about a few things that actually could be controlled with right information? And I think right information and responsible communication has never before been a focal point. So whether it is our colleagues in Twitter to Facebook to other social media platforms, I urge all of us to take a step back and possibly, for the first time, be restrained in our communication around COVID, because sometimes the rumor mill multiplies and what is supposed to be a small drop converts itself into an oceanic and tectonic impact. So that's one piece which all of us who are listening to this can really take back, at least as an individual and as a citizen of the world.
That's great advice, Manu. You remind me that the saying somebody told me once, that just because you can doesn't mean you should. And social media can give us a big voice. It doesn't necessarily always mean our voice should be heard. It's about being really thoughtful about the impact of messaging and information on people. Well, thanks everyone for sharing your views about key trends shaping the impact of work. What I would like to do is take just a few moments to kind of compare and contrast. What does that look like in different parts of Asia? And let me just throw out a couple of factoids that I think are kind of interesting. And this is really more for people who've really not lived in this region. One of the things that often people that haven't spent time here is really just how big it is, and don't necessarily realize that, let's say you're going to fly from, say, Singapore to Sydney I think it's like almost a 10-hour flight. Or is it to Christchurch is 10 hours. I mean, it is it's longer than going from New York to London. And we'll have people that'll fly from Singapore to Sydney for like a 2-hour meeting sometimes. You look at the land mass of China and the United States, and it's actually very similar. It's about 2.4 billion acres. India is about 812 million acres. But if you contrast it with numbers of the cities over a million, the US has 10 cities over a million people, whereas China has 65 cities over a million people, and India has more than 46 cities that are over 100 people, so a lot more population density. So a lot of times when we talk about Asia, we tend to talk about it as if it is this common area, but we underestimate the differences. I want to just start by asking Manu and Suyen, just share, what do you see are some of the key differences between what I call North Asia and South Asia? So think about Korea, Japan, North China versus India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. How would you characterize some of the key differences? as in terms of experience of work?
I'd say, and I'll add a couple of pointers, and saying, and you could surely add to your experiences of having worked in these geographies. One of the biggest dynamics is centered around the concept of commitment and loyalty to organizations. If I really see the North Asia workforce pattern, I still see a lot of focus and a lot of, I would say, significance being attached to the brand I work for and my commitment and loyalty in terms of how long do I work with them. When you really take a shift towards the dynamics of South Asia, or call it India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the alike workforces, these workforces are 70% millennials. And they contribute to amongst the world's largest and youngest working population. And there, the biggest shift in focus is actually around the concept of loyalty, not to the organization, but loyalty to the job or the purpose with which they're working. So I'd start with this as one compare and contrast. Suyang, do you want to add others?
Yeah, I mean, it's anything else. It's difficult to broad brush, but I'd say in North Asia, we have a much larger concentration of larger, more well-established companies. So, you know, the oldest company in the world is from Japan, for example. So when you have larger entities, whether it's the Korean chaebols or the Japanese conglomerates, that builds a very different type of work structure than in South Asia and Southeast Asia, where just given the stage of economic development, I think you see a lot more smaller scale organizations that at the stage of trying to build scale, even the family conglomerates, which are, you know, quite significant, are not at the same level of scale as the businesses are in North Asia. Again, gross generalization. But I think that also builds in sort of a difference in terms of thinking about work cultures and how those organizations are developing.
Thank you. Now let me contrast China versus the rest of Asia. Kat, you lived there for 5 years. You are a Chinese Singaporean. Compare and contrast China versus the rest of Asia on experience of work.
A hard one, right? Because I kind of took myself back to my life in China. I spent 12 years in corporate world in Dell, and then ran a franchise. My husband and I ran our own business. We didn't know what we were thinking, but man, was that a great experience, right? And actually, to be honest, all I can see commonalities. So I'd like to speak to the commonalities versus the differences. So what, if I kind of just bring myself, okay, what's different? The sights, the smells, the sound, very, very different, right? You step in there, every different parts of Asia, it smells different, it sounds different, it tastes different. But if I compare and contrast China, I want to speak to the commonalities. Huge commonality in the desire to drive for a better future. It is a nation that's working hard to drive for a better future, much like Singapore, much like many parts of Asia. A big run and to embrace technology and to apply it to every parts of their lives. And in fact, if anything at all, China has really, really grown in leaps and bounds in terms of how they have embraced technology, right? And the thirst for exposure, for knowledge, to know more, to be better. In fact, as I talk about it, I'm kind of transported back there to the energy there, to the chaos, and yet the drive to get to a better place. So these are the commonalities that really left a strong imprint in my experience working there. Now, if I have to make really to use Suyang's word, gross generalization, then across Asia, the more affluent a society is, the more complacency and entitlement there is. And the more a country is trying to develop, there is a lot more hunger and thirst and drive to want to get to a better place. right? And I don't think that's necessarily only in Asia, but that's human nature, right? Because we are all, it's that hierarchy of needs. So that's kind of where my thoughts are at this point.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I would only add just boringly pragmatic difference is China is really on different communication platforms. And so for a lot of companies that are doing things with mobile platforms and social media, that is an issue because a lot of the tools that we might use outside of China, we don't. For instance, everyone that I'm connected to in China, we're using WeChat. We use WeChat for, for video and everything. And the other thing I see is that they're far more advanced in the integration of payments in the whole payment space. And so there you see a lot of innovation coming out of China now in terms of use of AI, because they don't have the privacy issues that most other countries, or particularly Western countries, have around data if they feel that it's for the good of the people. So it's being used in novel ways for diagnostic testing in medicine, but also just, the apps that you use to pay for you just don't use cash hardly anymore. So I kind of feel like those are two super practical differences.
Absolutely. And there are many people who said to me, oh, is it true that employees in China are a lot more reserved? They keep opinions to themselves. The answer is a big no, right? Working there, I was highly stimulated because my team members would question me when I asked them to do something. They will ask why. They will come back with different ways of getting it done versus, okay, just tell me how to do it. So it is a very dynamic environment and highly competitive.
I just want to say I'm how happy I am that you said that. So I have a lot of data about people's experience. We run all these surveys for a lot of different types of organizations, and one of the key data points, one of my favorite questions that we ask in a survey is, I feel free to speak my mind without fear of negative consequences. And that data I have is very low in Singapore, by the way, amongst the globe, and Japan, very high in China. People don't believe me when I say, because that's what it's like to work in China. People tell you what they think.
Totally. And I love that. They will stand up for what they believe for. Every cab driver that you speak to has a clear opinion about the country, about its politics, not a complaint, but a clear opinion. Yeah. And I love that. I love that about operating in the environment.
I realize that I need to move us to implications for HR. I could stay on this topic all day because I think it's so interesting and there's so many differences. My last factoid I leave you all with is that in the United States, there's 430 languages. Across Asia, there's 3,200. 8 times more language diversity. Third question for us to explore is, what does it all mean for HR? What are the implications for HR, particularly in Asia? Kat?
I was speaking to my team about this. The latest thing I'm on to is we need to unlearn HR to be a much better and much more effective HR leader going forward, right? And I say HR leader because HR really is not a support function. HR is a leadership function. HR should be the futurist of the organization. And many of us, some a lot younger than I am, so at least I grew up in HR, learning about HR policies, HR processes, HR programs, and those are things to unlearn. Those are given. It should be frictionless, right? We should spend our energy on building. In Starhub, I have 3 words: mojo, muscles, and mechanism. Those are the 3 things that HR is driving. Mojo for culture, muscles for capabilities, and mechanisms is all the programs and all that thing that we used to do growing up. So the focus should be on driving the culture that enable the business and bringing in new ways of working, because that's what is going to take us to the new place, and building the right muscles for the organization in terms of bench strength, in terms of the shape of the workforce, building the right skills and capabilities. So we need to unlearn HR. If there's one thing that I really want to emphasize, is we need to unlearn HR in order to be the HR of tomorrow.
So for those of you that are looking at Kat right now, I just want you to know that the last time she was at my office, she had a shocking pink hair. And I said, Kat, why is your hair pink? And she said, why not? And now she tells me I'm a closet millennial. Now we know.
That's right.
So let me ask the others. Yeah, you're so respectable now. What are some of the other implications for HR? And I know, Louis, you started to touch on this a little bit earlier about kind of the role of technology shaping HR. So say more a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I won't, just in the interest of time and to hear from others that, I guess where I was going with that point earlier, Alison, was that I think HR needs to adopt a much more critically oriented mindset, much more evidence-based in the way that it makes decisions and tackles problems. I think a lot of the stuff that we have been doing is a sort of solution looking for a problem rather than a response to a real one. And, I think that, there are some examples of that floating around. I also think that some of the solutions that organizations are adopting are underneath a response to a real problem that just needs to be better understood. Many organizations right now are enthusiastic about concepts like, for example, growth mindset or mindfulness, etc. Whether or not these things work, I don't know. But, I think the jury is out. But I think the point is that they are a response to an important problem that many people feel the need to grow to be relevant, to adapt the way they live their lives so that they are not so overwhelmed by the influx of information they experience, particularly at work. So we've innovated to be able to deliver a huge volume of information to an individual, but that person has rarely changed their life in order to be able to adapt to that. So, I think in HR, we have a responsibility to think about what are the implications for the way that we're changing work. How do we help people through that transition? What does it mean for us as a people function?
Yeah. Well, Louis, you'll just have to watch this space because we just completed some linkage research where we showed growth mindset of CEOs of 65 businesses was the biggest predictor of year-on-year sales growth of their companies. Can't wait.
I know, that sounds wonderful. I mean, I just like I say, if a mindset is a belief system, the idea that someone believes something different and that makes them better immediately. I mean, I'm sure they're already tremendously talented people. I just think that underneath that there is a lot going on, and that's why we have to step back and understand what are we really doing. Yeah.
So, and I always appreciate that you're a big advocate of science-based and fact-based and not fad-based management. I want to ask Suyen, what do you think is the big implication for HR?
So, when I do a lot of work in leadership development, one of the things that HR leaders are often very focused on is how do I build business leaders who are much develop regional business leaders and global business leaders in Asia, because what very often happens is you have a business leader who may be fantastic in Japan or fantastic in Thailand, but then eventually you want this person to take on the business in North Asia, South Asia, and so forth. And how do you actually do that? Well, unfortunately, what happens is, the saying, the cobbler's children don't wear any shoes. I think HR needs to apply that same lens to itself. So HR as a function needs to become much more savvy in terms of managing regionally and globally, which means that HR leaders need to, from a skills development perspective, truly appreciate the diversity that we've been talking about the entire session, and also look at things with a much more nuanced lens. HR historically has really been about, we like simplicity and consistency and alignment and equity and all those fantastic words, which are all very important, of course, but that sort of misses a lot of the nuance in terms of how do we actually make sure that what we're trying to put in place is fit for purpose and appreciates the diversity of the region.
Very nice. Manu, I'll go to you last. What do you believe is a key implication for HR of all these trends that we're talking about?
So As I was listening to Kat Lewis and Suyong, one of the biggest pieces which comes to my mind in addition is the mindset shift and the DNA shift in the function that we all have been talking about for decades. But it's become a lot more pertinent and almost business continuity for the sustenance and growth of the function, a necessity. And I'll kind of debrief this in a double click moment. Like Lou stated, that with the advancement of digital, fact based decision making has taken a lot more significant space. I also say that 70% of the traditional roles of the people function have moved and have automated or have become extinct. So if you have a DNA as an HR function, which is actually still working in the gone by era of attaching yourself to transactional operating ways of work, I think it's time to wake up and I say, smell the coffee, because this is one of the most critical phases which will continue to create a need and sustenance for the function. If you'd also see a phenomena globally, and I'm seeing this a lot more in my country, that more and more of critical HR function roles are being filled by business. Again, that's a reflection for me, because with the advent of technology, when the core functional job has actually been automated, what is it that I offer to the table becomes a very, very important point. So am I a change agent? Am I a communications expert? Am I a coach to the business? Am I a confidant for my employee experience? All of this comes back to the fruition. And I think it also circles back, which is a challenge as well as an opportunity, is extraordinary UX, which I started with. That does my function really care about experience more than just driving processes and systems?
So I want to recap a couple of things that I've heard and give each of you a chance to have one final word. Just in terms of the key themes that I'm hearing you talk about for HRs, bringing it together. One is about the need to really embrace and accelerate the need to unlearn what we've learned about making HR successful in the past. And a piece of that is about unlearning the roles of HR and accepting that they're evolving quickly, and that technology is a big driver of that. More of the roles that we used to think are HR are now filled by the business, and others are going away. There was another theme of really learning to see through the fads, really being able to drive focus with data and facts to manage the fads, and to build capabilities that aren't just going to work within one market, but that would work across the region and across the globe as more functions span those boundaries. What I'd like to do is I'm going to ask each of you to just share a parting thought as we wrap up from this conference or this panel on the experience of work in Asia. I'll start with you, Manu, since you were the last. What's your key takeaway or parting thought?
My parting thought for everyone who's listening into us is focus on experience and treat your employees alike the consumers at marketplace.
Thank you. Kat?
My parting thought is HR plays such a pivotal role in driving change in an organization. So going forward, we must embrace HR as a leadership role, a change agent, a super communicator, and the champion of new ways of working, focused very much on the user experience.
Super, thank you. Su-Yen?
My thought was that HR as a driver of the business really needs to be well-rounded. So by well-rounded, HR, of course, needs to know about HR, but almost as importantly, perhaps even more critically, HR needs to know about finance, HR needs to know about marketing, you talk about user experience, HR needs to know about communication, risk management, technology. It's about being a holistic partner to the business, which necessarily requires moving outside the HR domain and understanding a lot more of the other adjacent functions.
I just want to build on what Su-Yen has just said, right? It just inspired me to, it's so clear in my head, HR is a horizontal function. We are not a vertical function. We integrate the entire organization, and that is so important for us to understand that it's a horizontal function.
And that's one of the reasons why the thinking in an agile way is so powerful.
Exactly, and knowing every part of the business, that's almost a given.
Yeah, super. Lewis, your parting thought?
This left me thoughtful about the importance of the conversation around skills. And, in the work that we have been doing with the Singapore government, what we're seeing, an increasing focus on soft, or what we might call core or horizontal skills as critical for long-term, for immediate but long-term success. So in Asia, if we take that lens, I think we've been really focused on technical skills as the route to success. In our research, we show that actually, in the web scraping that we're doing, that in the US, job posts mention almost double the number of soft skills versus job posts for Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, developed Asian cities. And so I think we need to put a lot more focus on what are the soft skills that enable us to be effective, personal self-management, collaboration with others, that flexible cognitive capacity to see across problems. I think we'll see a lot more focus on that, not just
Lewis,
in the immediate.
I realize I'm going to have to cut you off because we got to go.
Okay.
We are out of
really?
time. You all are so amazing. I really appreciate it. For those of you who've listened to us, I hope you go away inspired to either learn more or share more about some of the differences and complexities of the region. I think you're hearing a lot of themes you'll hear from people wherever they are in the world, and then some unique themes also. Well, it's the beginning of our day. For the rest of you, it's the end of yours. We wish you good night, good morning, or good day, wherever you may be. Thank you.